Okay, welcome everyone. Because we only have 15 minutes for these sessions, I think it's time to start. We are actually waiting for our moderator for this session, but I will make a start so we can get ahead with the discussion. So again, welcome to the diplomacy track. Our first session is titled Seamless Procedures: Is the Future of Diplomatic Meetings a Blend of Online and In Situ? So very interesting questions, also something my colleague Stephanie Borg-Seiler just brought up in the discussion we had, basically saying she thinks the future of meetings is blended. To kind of get us started, I would like to hand over to our moderator, Ursula Weinhofen, who is with the International Telecommunications Union. So Ursula, good to see you, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Katharina. Hi, everybody. It's really exciting to be part of this really timely event today. As you mentioned, this first component in the diplomacy track is about seamless procedures and whether the future of diplomatic meetings, a blend of online and in situ or in person. And as I mentioned, it's very topical because when you're looking at diplomatic meetings, so many have been postponed, cancelled, or gone online. And because of lockdowns, restrictions on gathering, travel restrictions, and requirements of social distancing, there may not be many hybrid in-person online meetings or processes going on right now. But looking ahead to the time when some of the restrictions on gatherings are lifted, there may become an option and more common. And some meetings are already discussing certain issues online and deferring other parts, other discussions, other issues until a meeting can be held in person. So it's very timely to consider now whether such meetings can work, and if so, under what conditions, what benefits might they bring, what might be some of the challenges, etc. And just because something can be done, of course, doesn't mean it should be done. So let's start with a poll on hybrid meetings to gain some of the insight of those who've joined us for this discussion. You see it on your screen now, I believe. So I invite you to select. I think you can just click and then click submit. As you can notice, the question might be a bit leading, and so we added a last point there. So just in case you don't agree, you have an option as well to select. So we'll just allow folks some time to read through those, and then shortly we'll have the results. How are we going, Katharina, on the results?
So as you can see, it looks very interesting. Let me just end the poll and share results.
Okay. Lovely.
So we should be able to see that now, and it's very interesting because 65% are emphasizing, 63% are emphasizing inclusiveness as the main reason.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, they're pretty clear cut, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe we didn't need to worry that it might be a leading question. It looks like we had a lot of
exactly.
That's certainly very, very interesting. And I wonder if we could unpack those results a little bit. And as was mentioned, we invite you to use the group chat to indicate your interest to weigh in. Just wondering, we had a number of options in the poll, and I don't know, Katharina, if it's possible to also simultaneously as the chat have it up on the screen so we can actually look again at the options that people were selecting from, because it'd be great to see if there's others on this in this discussion who may have other benefits that they wanted to flag that maybe weren't listed in the poll. In the poll, there were that it results in better decisions and inclusiveness, better meeting dynamics. I think there was also an option about building on current innovations.
Mm-hmm.
But
let me just read the results again, maybe, so we can build on this.
Can we keep them on the screen, Katharina? Or
I'm not sure, but I have them in front of me, so I can.
Okay.
I can tell you.
Great. Yeah, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. So this question of blended meetings, one option was results in better decisions. Only 4% believe that they actually result in better decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Another option was it makes for better meeting dynamics. It's a bit more, 17%.
Mm-hmm.
Then it is important to build on current innovations. That's 15%. then it does not provide any added value, 2%. So the people who are more critical, which is of course very important, because as you said, Ursula, not everything that can be done should be done. But really the majority of people emphasize that blended meetings will be important or are important to ensure inclusiveness. That's 63%.
Oh, great. I see we have the results back on.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you. One of the things which, as you mentioned, and as we can see here, inclusiveness rates very highly. And it just reminds me of one sort of counter story, and we were talking about this, Katerina, when we had a discussion yesterday. Sometimes when there can be a difference between the experience of participation online and the experience of participation in person. So perhaps it's a different hybrid where you have a meeting that has both types of participants, as opposed to a process where you maybe have some parts that are in person for everyone and some parts that are online for everyone. Because in the latter case, the experience, in theory at least, can be the same for everyone. But where you have a different kind of hybrid meeting where you have some online and some in person, that could potentially raise other issues of inclusiveness. And the experience I was sharing is, for instance, in the human resources context, when you have interviews, which of course are a kind of meeting, and some people could attend in person and other candidates can only attend online, that often there's a practice where everything is done online to try and create a fairer scenario for everybody, so that there's no difference between those who can be there in person or not. And I just wonder if folks think that that this other sort of aspect of inclusiveness could be relevant in the context of diplomatic meetings. And part of why I raise this is because I have heard, for instance, that sometimes when member states are deciding what format they want to take, whether they want to have a meeting online or whether they want to defer to a time when they can all meet in person, that some opt to do the latter because they don't feel confident that they could have sufficiently inclusive an experience if things were done online. Let's go to the chat and just see
Exactly.
if had any views.
We only have a few minutes left, but I've been having a look at the chat and it's very interesting. So a lot of people obviously chose the option of inclusiveness, but there was an emphasis that inclusiveness only works if it's done right. So we started kind of discussing the limits of current technology, also some of the limits we are experiencing right now using Zoom. But there was a strong emphasis on, yes, inclusiveness, but we really have to get it right from the technological side, but also how to organize it, basically. I didn't see any raised hands or any indications for someone wanting to come in by voice, but already a lot of interesting points in the chat.
Absolutely. It seems really clear that that there's a lot of potential for inclusiveness, but that folks really feel that getting the conditions right is absolutely critical to live up to that potential. So looks like on the whole, folks think that we should expect, as we move out of the current crisis, to continue to see more online meetings, also in the diplomatic context.
Exactly. There were also some comments on using specific platforms, especially in the context of the United Nations or other international organizations. So this kind of question of, do we need purpose-built platforms? And this is, of course, one of the biggest challenges we've been seeing right now. It's a larger comment, not just for blended meetings, but I think it's a very important one.
Yes, and the language issue also is absolutely critical, making sure that the functionality is there so that you can really also achieve that inclusion and everyone can really participate in their language.
Exactly, and some of these issues we will address in the coming sessions. So we only have 1 minute left. It's a very, very short time frame, of course. Is there anyone who would like to come in by voice or
Katerina,
raise one final point? Yes, please.
Sorry, I wanted to raise my hand. This is Stefano Baldi speaking. I will speak even later, so I shouldn't now. But it's very tempting, the results of the poll. And it's tempting because I think we should look also what it means, what it is inside the inclusiveness. And part of this is the fact it's related to financial issues, to the fact of money. We didn't talk about this, but I think this is an issue because for many countries or for many participants or for many delegates, financial possibilities are an issue, especially when they have to travel long, and time, of course. But let's put it. So I think inside this result, there are many other interesting elements that should be considered. Thank you.
I think indeed that is a really good point, and I think some of the online meetings perhaps have seen more participation, including because of that, because there weren't cost obstacles and travel that prevented people from joining. So very good point. Thank you so much.
Good. Unfortunately, because I think there's a lot to discuss, the only thing I have left to do is to kind of draw a line under this session and, so to speak, close this session and move us to the next session. And we actually already heard from the next session speaker. So the next session is called Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary Online Between Tradition and Innovation. To moderate and to lead the discussion, we have Ambassador Stefano Baldi, who is Ambassador of Italy in Bulgaria at the moment. Stefano, would you like to start introducing the topic and give us some first ideas? Okay, there seems to be a problem with muting because we can't hear you, Stefano.
Okay, now I mute myself.
Now we can. Perfect.
Yes, it's okay. I keep discovering, the nuts and bolts of Zoom because there are so many little details, and this is part of what I wanted to highlight. Sadly, there are many changes going on, and I think it's interesting that diplomats have been faced with this acceleration and sprint that was mentioned before. And I can tell you from my position and my experience of the last couple of months that I was very happy because I've always been excited about online, whatever, training, meetings or whatever. But now I've seen that many of my colleagues, they have been forced, kindly or softly forced to use and to learn and to be part of this online trend, and especially for online meeting, even in a bilateral situation like you have, not only in the multilateral where you expect this even more. What is my point? My point is that were diplomats ready for this? No. My point is no. And what I can see is that, of course, everybody has been forced to do this, but certainly not everybody has done it in the best possible way. What it means? It means that some structures were not ready to organize these things, so they try to do their best. Some people were not used to this kind of virtual touch, and so the participation was not that effective. But certainly we have covered a long way with this push that we received. So we certainly is this going to last also in our sector, in our field? My answer is absolutely yes. But it doesn't mean that it will last in the most effective way. This depends very much on us, on many things we will do. Let me say one last thing for the discussion. We were not ready, as I said, most of diplomats were not ready. Why this? Again, this is an old story, because training was not done. So, of course, we are learning by doing, but learning by doing is not the only way to learn. There is also learning by training first, sometimes which can save a lot of hassle, a lot of problems. And that certainly, there is also a lot to be done in there. I would stop here because we have very short time, and I would like to hear from others and react.
Definitely. Thank you, Stefano. So one focus of this session is on protocol and how protocol needs to be updated for moving online. And we've seen a couple of interesting examples so far, especially, for example, from the UN Security Council. We had a bit of a discussion with some participants before this event. So if he's available, I would like to bring in Amma Ayuvali, who is the Egyptian ambassador in Belgrade, to share just some of his reflections. Amma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kat, and thank you, Ambassador Baldi, for moderating this session. Good to see many old friends and good to make new ones through this new technology. And I think it's very relevant to ask this question, Dr. Kat, at the beginning, because diplomacy is an old profession that rests on a very solid foundation of traditions. And one aspect of tradition is protocol. And protocol is not necessarily only a way of establishing hierarchy, but it's also a way of organizing and structuring the meetings in which diplomats participate. So this is one particular challenge that that faces online platforms, and I'm glad that Diplo, as usual, is ahead of the curve and already thinking about this aspect. So, for example, if we imagine, I would like to give you two experiences in which we've been through in Belgrade. We conducted a number of online meetings for the Francophonie ambassadors and maybe one or two for the Arab ambassadors established in Belgrade. And the one interesting challenge is, for example, when the host, the technical host, is not necessarily the chair of the group. So here you have a duplication, I don't want to say of authority, but a duplication of roles, whereby in a face-to-face meeting, the chair of the group would have been the one to allow the other participants to speak and to make comments and so on and so forth, whereas this may not necessarily be the case in online platforms. The second aspect is that online platforms assumes a certain level of informality, whereby everyone can speak more or less at the same time and maybe with the same authority, whereby there are rules of procedure in multilateral diplomacy that would actually give certain privileges and rights to members of a council or so, and then lesser for observers and lesser for other participants. So I think these are challenges that online platforms face today, and it will be important to adapt the online platform to established practices and traditions of diplomacy, and at the same time develop established and inherited, should we say so, rules of procedure and protocol to the new online platforms. And I think this particular session, chaired by Ambassador Baldi and moderated by your good self, is a very good start in this regard. Thank you once again.
Yes. Can I say something, Catherine, on this? This is exactly, Amra, you always touch on the right points, and I can tell you that this idea of having host and chair, which is quite new, it makes quite a difference if you compare with what happens with live meetings. And this is exactly the good example of what I noticed, that many diplomats are not familiar with this. So if you don't have the skills, you cannot chair an online meeting unless you chair it very, very badly, because you must know the tools that you have available. You know, we know the tools, we don't realize, but we know the tools that we have available on a live meeting, but it's different, and you have to adapt with depending on what kind of platform you use. And here you have another problem that we are facing, and we faced also here. Depending on the platform you use, which are similar but not the same, you have certain possibilities or others, and you can do certain things or others in different ways, and that affects the meeting itself. Because if you're not familiar, and you know, today you have to use Team, and tomorrow you have to use Zoom, and the day after tomorrow WebEx, every time you have to rework. Either if you are a participant, which is still easier, but certainly if you are chairing it, then it becomes more difficult. And since I've been chairing some of the meetings here, I've noticed this. So that's why I say you need to be prepared. Otherwise, everybody will either complain because some rules or some things cannot be done. And when I say rules, even protocol, but certainly you need adaptation, or because somebody is excluded, or you have bad meetings, even worse. So they will say, online meetings don't work, you know, but even live meetings don't work if you have a bad chair, or if you have, for some participants are not prepared or something. So that doesn't make any difference. So I will leave the floor to others or to the chat.
Definitely. We have quite a lively discussion in the chat. Let me just try and briefly summarize. And again, invitation open to anyone who wants to come in by voice. So first off, a very interesting question from Ambassador Kishan Rana, who basically says, obviously online meetings are proliferating, but there are security concerns. They are far from robust. What specifically is happening at the UN Security Council? And then there was a bit of a move into this direction of security is very important, and everyone really agreed on this topic. Then an interesting comment about generational questions. So obviously we have to adapt quite fast. Are younger people more able to make this adaptation? And there was quite some controversial discussion on that. Then again, the question of a toolkit or principles and guidelines that need to be drafted perhaps. And then last but not least, a question on, which one was it? Let me see, there was one more point that I found interesting, but I think I'm just going to leave it for now and hand over to you, Stefano, for reflections.
Yes, you know, everything you've said is very tempting. Especially, certainly the guidelines would be very, very useful. One thing I want to say as from now is that anyway, this period will be very useful because a lot of people have put their hands on. And so they are realizing that it's something possible, which has limitations, but it's also very useful. One main issue that in the past, and even nowadays, was preventing or anyway limited very much the use of online, especially for meetings, is security. You know, it's like a Moloch. Security is like a god that you have to sacrifice everything to, which is true, but to a certain extent. And I think this issue has been abused, is being abused even nowadays. I don't want to simplify it. There are issues which are extremely sensitive. I'm not talking about the Security Council, but look, Security Council accounts for 0.00 something of online meetings that you could organize. I'm talking about the rest 99%, you know, where you can discuss issues with a certain amount of security. It doesn't mean that everybody should be invited. It's not a party, an online meeting. But if you know how to use the tools, and this is, I think, another session that I cannot participate, but I would be very much interested. If you know the tools properly, then you can assume that security is ensured to a certain extent. It's not like being in a locked room, but certainly it's enough for many issues that are going to be discussed. So this security should be clear to even our administrations, and here I have a lot of stories to tell. Are young people more prepared or young diplomats, you know, more ready to this than the rest? Probably yes, but I think that some young people, on the other hand, are disappointing. They're not so, you know, so as much ready as we would expect. And sometimes you have some old guys who are enthusiasts and have the power to impose these things. So we have to work on all generations just to make it not the main tool, but certainly a normal tool of our work now that we have started. We have great opportunity ahead, and we should not spoil it.
Definitely. Related to this, there's one interesting point, and that's the one I wanted to mention beforehand. Again, related to this question of rules of procedures in online meetings, and this question of that Amr mentioned, this assumption of everyone can speak on an equal footing. So Richard Hill mentioned, well, it's just a question of the chairperson kind of enforcing those rules. At the same time, Liz Galvez, a former senior diplomat from the UK, doubts this and basically says there is a huge lack of skill and there's a need for capacity building and for training, because even in situ meetings, some chairs are just not that good, and then if you bring that online, you need additional training.
Yes, and I think the additional training and knowledge, it's essential to establish in the future what kind of protocol we are going to apply to the online meetings, which means, in my opinion, there will be needed certainly adjustments. I don't want to say if there are small adjustments or big adjustments, because then we can discuss what is small and what is big. But you don't need to recreate something. You need to adjust what is already there. But if you do this exercise with somebody who doesn't know how it works, he will pretend that you will have exactly the same rules applied online. On the other hand, if you speak with somebody who doesn't know why you have certain protocols in live meetings, then he will pretend that you have to completely remake the rules because, these are all part of the tradition and it's all things. There are reasons for protocols. We know that very well. It's not something which comes out of the blue. So there are very good reasons sometimes. So you really need to know from both sides, from the traditional part and from the innovation part, before you set up, let's say, new rules. So this is something we shouldn't expect to have a new protocol for online learning to use online learning. We should start using, as we are doing, online learning and work on the protocols, which sometimes is related also to different situations, to different contexts. But certainly there are major rules that can be applied everywhere. But the capacity building that you mentioned before is essential. Otherwise, we go nowhere. It's a no-go.
Definitely. So officially, we're out of time for this session. So let me explain a few options you have now. So officially, we have a coffee break now. You have several options. You can stay in this room, continue the conversation, or you navigate in your browser or on your device. You go back to the main page with all the links. I just put the link in the chat. So that's meetings.diplomacy.edu/live. And there again, you'll have several options to join the coffee lounge or visit an art exhibition. So lots of options for you. We will see you back here at 1:15. So in just 13 minutes to continue the discussion on this topic. But for now, maybe enjoy some coffee, maybe go for the art exhibition or stay in this room and continue the conversation. I will certainly be around here and I will see you in 13 minutes at 1:15. Thank you so much to Stefano and Ursula for kicking us off, which is not an easy task, especially as we're experimenting with this format. So much appreciated. Much appreciated for your comments in the chat and your questions. And let's have some coffee or just enjoy some time off and a conversation on the sidelines. Thank you so much. Liz just raised her hand. Liz, would you like to say something as well? Obviously, good to see you, as always.
Yes, I wanted to say that I think with chairing skills are quite difficult, and I don't know how many foreign ministries actually teach their diplomats how to chair international meetings. I know that it's done in the FCO because of EU meetings. Everyone will have to chair. Well, not so much us anymore, but we'll have to chair meetings at some point. But I think with online meetings, you need in a way a double chair. You need to have someone who is actually listening to what is being said and able to sum up at the end. But you will also need to have somebody that is going to be monitoring the chat, if you have chat, who is going to be able to check if someone is raising their hand, because obviously if you're in a room, you can see if the flag is going up and you make a note, and you have a technical secretariat. Now, I know there were some concerns maybe about the technical secretariat making decisions that the chairman should take, but I don't think that that is such a problem, really. That already exists, that you have in the UN, for example, you will always have a secretary of the meeting who is advising all the time the chairman what to do, what to say. They write everything out for them. And this is why I said that some people don't have a clue how to chair a meeting. They think all it means is I give so-and-so the floor, I give somebody else the floor, and that's it. Now that is, to me, is not chairing a meeting. If you have informal meetings and you have moderators, that requires a completely different skill set, and a lot of people don't have that. But for online, as I just repeat, I think you need two people in effect. performing the function that maybe you would have one person in an in situ meeting. I'm happy to be contradicted by Ginger, who does a lot of online meetings, I know, but that's my opinion.
But I mean, from our experience, no contradiction at all. We definitely have actually several people monitoring the chat in our bigger meetings. So lots of the debates we organized online in the last couple of weeks had 100 up to 200 participants in a Zoom room. Then we streamed it on YouTube and then on Facebook. So we had one person monitoring Zoom, another person looking at the comments that were coming in on Facebook, another person looking at what's happening on YouTube. And I mean, even for that person who only has to look into what's happening in the chat, it's a lot. You're definitely right. And then maybe even definitely add a third person on the technological side. And I don't mean the hard technological side. I mean things like displaying images, making sure the right graphs are there, making sure people are able to mute and unmute and helping people with that. So actually, if you think about it, we often say, oh, it's so much easier doing things online, much more smoother, we save on personnel. But actually, we might not. It might be just as personal intense, if not more, than an in situ meeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think Ginger wants to say something.
Yes, and then Amer, who has raised his hand. So Ginger and then Amer, keeping in mind we only have 3 minutes before the next session. Please go ahead.
I actually didn't need to speak, but I did want to remind you that there are virtual brownies in the back of the room, Jovan. That's how we got people to stay. We're feeding them. I just very briefly, we didn't introduce, but I'm working somewhat as a chat moderator. Marco is here as our help desk. So there are definitely behind the scenes moderators and personnel going on. We also have a track coordinator and tech people keeping an eye on us. So just wanted to explain the action and reality of the theory.
That's an interesting, Ginger, while we are waiting, interesting dynamics, how many people you need for preparation of real life event and online event. And it's amazing how much work you have to put into online event, because the tolerance for failures are much lower. If PowerPoint doesn't work in real life event, okay, you make a joke, but if there is a bad sound or bad connection, online meetings basically fail. And what Ginger mentioned is Marco and other colleagues, Kat moderating it brilliantly. And that's sort of one of the outcome of our course. And I can see quite a few participants at our course on online meeting was exactly understanding of complexity, what's going on behind the scene. And definitely Amer was one of the most active students in the course. And I can see a few other names. Therefore, that sort of virtual illusion that online brings easiness on everything, less efforts, it's quite sort of tricky, and I would say even dangerous.
Yes. The last word for the coffee break, maybe Amer, just to stick to protocol, and then we start officially with the discussion again. Over to you, Amer, for the final words.
Thank you, Kat. I don't want to be like the less optimistic one, but I think the more online platforms become or appear as very different from face-to-face platforms with regard to diplomacy, the more resistance there will be, because diplomats are used to protocol and are used to a predictable way of running the meeting. So I would suggest that in the beginning phase, in the transitional phase between regular diplomacy and then more digital diplomacy, that the more we can import from the traditional conduct of face-to-face diplomacy, the more secure and safe and comfortable diplomats would feel, and therefore the more engaging there will be, and then we can start to develop these a little bit further. So maybe I just wanted to put that injection, since we're all hyper enthusiastic about new online platforms. Thank you so much. That's a good point to end the coffee break on and move to our next session, which kind of seamlessly fits into this discussion. So the topic for our next 15-minute discussion is discuss, draft, and vote, moving diplomatic practice online. To moderate, we have Katharina Frey, who is from the Permanent Mission of Switzerland to the United Nations
in Vienna, and I'm very much looking forward to having her here. So for our first introduction, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Katerina. Well, it's quite a challenge, apparently being moderating with one of the best, as I just learned, best online moderators to do it first time in my life. But thank you for giving me the opportunity. As you mentioned, I'm a Swiss diplomat currently working in Vienna at the UN, for the UN in Vienna. I think I just have to bring this caveat. So if I express some opinions, it's mainly my personal experience and not like the official Swiss position. I just needed to say that. It got quite smoothly, the discussion. I think that we tried to have the next 15 minutes to what my previous speaker ended in concluding the coffee break. When I think you mentioned that it's diplomats sometimes are very protocolar, they need some times to adjust. So now I think we've just been quite thrown into this like phase where we are just forced, for obvious reasons, to work more virtually. I think many procedures need to go on. And I think what we would like to discuss now is from the many diplomatic functions, the ones that are in negotiating and drafting together amongst the member states, to discuss with you how we could switch those also into a virtual world, maybe and hopefully not permanently, because we do believe that physical exchange is also very much important, but for the time being at least, that we could do it partially online and maybe also in hybrid forms for the month to come. So what we would like to discuss with you in this next probably now 13 minutes would be, what do you think are the criteria that has to be respected? What part can be done online and which part of the diplomatic work cannot be done online? Katerina has prepared a poll, as always, so we could start maybe with starting with the poll that you can see right now. And then, of course, as always, you can always ask questions in the chat functions. And as it was expressed, I think I have many helpers that will help me to see all the questions that are in the chat. And then we hope that we get out some criteria that we could use to also, that I personally can also use here in Vienna, to see how we could continue working also, because we do believe member states should continue work together, even in these times. So I give you a minute to answer the questions. I also did it myself.
Excellent. It's interesting to see results coming in, because the very first result we had was someone saying we need to rethink the procedures completely. So that's very interesting. But I think now the majority seems to be oscillating between we need to make small adjustments to existing procedures and we need to rethink completely. So that's very interesting. Certainly surprising for me.
Well, likewise. Well, I don't. Do you see like the polls now? Could we see it or not? Not yet.
I can see it, but I can, if people can't see it, because the impression on Zoom is different for everyone, so we can't actually force a certain perspective. So, but I can say, so we have 43 people out of 60 in the room who now voted, and 50% say we need to make small adjustments to existing procedures, and 44% say we need to rethink procedures completely. So basically, those are the two main opinions. Small adjustments or complete adjustment. 50-50 almost.
Very, very interesting. So I would be very interested. I think I would also be part of the person thinking that we do not have to adjust them completely. I also don't think that that's possible, at least not in the diplomatic world that I know. I think I was also mentioned in the coffee break before that at least at the UN level, where when you have 190 something member states that are very different, usually times move slowly. So I would hope, at least, maybe it's just wishful thinking, that we could go with not adjusting everything. So maybe if some of the ones who think that we have to adjust everything could point out and take the floor, that would be very helpful. Katerina, do you see that in the chat function, if someone would like to take the floor? Because I don't see it, I'm sorry. As you can see, I'm like a newcomer in this functions?
Don't worry, it's Zoom is very good, but it's very complicated to keep an eye on everything, definitely. So no, we don't have any specific comment on that question yet, on how people voted. So maybe that's a good invitation for those who say we need to rethink completely, to explain a bit or raise their hand or mention in the chat that they would like to take the floor.
Okay, I think maybe before we go to what's being discussed in the chat about inclusiveness, I think it's also a very important point. Maybe because maybe the question in the poll was a bit too broad. I think we could maybe discuss about if generally we have to do all the voting rules, if we have to adjust them, or just the way of how we discuss. That would be an interesting point. Maybe the people interpreted the question differently. I would like to ask to the chat here, and then maybe invite someone who also works in maybe not UN but other diplomatic area on how do you think, how have you switched now in this past? It's already been 2 months to working. Because what I could observe here, at least at the UN in Vienna, and I also hear from other colleagues in New York and Geneva, is that mainly like informal meetings are just being switched virtually. And what's still being discussed is mainly what to do with the formal meetings. So these questions are still ongoing at least here in Vienna. Is there anyone who would like to express how they do it in not UN level, but maybe in other multilateral organizations or bilateral? That would be interesting to hear. Can you help me, Katerina, because I cannot read the chat and also talk, I'm sorry.
No, definitely. So I don't see any raised hands at the moment. What we have in the chat is Holly Oberle saying she's an academic and she teaches diplomacy. And from her perspective, diplomacy needs to be retaught entirely. So this kind of fits with this idea of we need to adjust things very much.
That would be interesting. Maybe could we give Holly the floor that you could explain, Holly, on why you think that, or what exactly of diplomacy it has to be rethought totally? Like which part of the broad spectrum that I would find interesting. Would I give Holly the floor?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Well, I'm not quite sure why exactly, but I'm coming from academia, and we're now teaching online, and it's just not working. I mean, people I think that getting everybody online will be more inclusive, but I've had the opposite experience. Students are not participating nearly as much. Their attention span is much shorter. It was already very short. And they can easily be on Facebook while they're on their Zoom call. And obviously diplomats probably won't be on Facebook, or at least they shouldn't be, but I don't know exactly what the solutions are, but I feel as though online actually makes things less inclusive. The idea is good, but once you actually do it, it doesn't really work as well. And therefore, I would think that diplomacy would have a lot of the same challenges.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, first of all, I think even if you're like in the room, you could also be on Facebook now with the smartphones. That's unfortunately a bit just the time that we are in, that you have many options now. But what I do think where I do agree with what you said is about the concentration span. I also personally experienced it being in a virtual meeting being much more tiring than in let's say normal meetings that we're used to. And I think that's maybe also a bit linked, at least how I thought it's linked about with the fact that it's all new for us and maybe not for Katerina and the colleagues from the DiploFoundations, but for the newcomers, as at least me, quite challenging to understand all the different tools and to multitask in looking at the chat and also talk and then see whether you're muted. So I thought it's maybe more a bit lack of experience. So I think that's more about that we need time to get used to that. Katerina, is there any more like questions or like ideas on what specifically had to be adjusted?
Yeah, definitely. So one interesting observation that actually comes from our online course on online meetings that some who are in the room today attended. So this reflection actually comes from Ambassador Amer. So I'll just take the opportunity to bring that back into the discussion, because in this session we're talking about negotiation and negotiation moving online as part of the process. And in that course, the discussion basically was this. So, okay, there's lots of like reading of prepared speeches. So maybe we can just record these speeches, have them somewhere. And when we meet online all together in the same room, we basically can then focus on the negotiations. And the point he made, if I may, was basically that, yes, I mean, not a bad idea, but actually not really workable, because there's a lot of tradition and there's a lot of other things associated with this reading speeches and then negotiating. So we can't actually cut that out of the process. And then we have a very concrete question in the chat from Ambassador Kishan Rana, who basically focuses on drafting resolutions. And he's asking, is there any experience with drafting a resolution or any real world document via an online process? Because he thinks if we have an example like that, it's kind of the holy grail of moving things online.
That's very interesting. So to kind of a trial negotiations online. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, right now we are... Please go ahead.
Join the conversation, please? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Well, thank you very much, Katerina. My question simply was, is there any example of any group at the UN or at any UN agency having actually attempted to draft a document, a real world resolution, a joint statement or whatever online? Is there any practical experience with that? If there is, that would show how the process might work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have a couple of raised hands. I'm not quite sure about the order of in which people raised the hands. So excuse me if I'm getting the order wrong. But we have Yvette Stevenson, Lorraine Anderson, and Amma Agiwali raised their hands. So maybe in this order, you can very briefly, because we're almost out of time, share your perspective. So Yvette, over to you.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to raise the point about diplomacy. Many of these meetings were doing negotiations, and we all know how it is. It is not always so straightforward. There are many things have to be done behind the scenes. To be honest, there's also horse trading being done, and I don't know how this would be done, in an online meeting, because many a time when we get stuck, we go around, we meet people in the corridor, we chat, we make, and that's how can that work? There needs to be something that would bring that out, because that's the gist of negotiations, be it resolution, be it joint statement. There's a lot of negotiation going on, and it's not the sort of negotiation, for instance, when I'm negotiating in person, it's not something I will not do the same thing where I know that I am, being viewed by everybody. Most of the time you go and meet somebody who is against you or who is on the opposite side, and you try to bring things out together. I don't see how that would be done in Zoom meetings.
Okay, thank you. Let me just bring in the other three before we wrap up. Is that okay with you, Katerina?
Yeah.
Okay. So then Lorraine Anderson.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to answer the question. Although I'm not directly involved, I do know that currently, as we speak, colleagues are negotiating a resolution for the WHA on a COVID-19 response virtually. And I know it's been challenging and slow going, so I can't give details of how, but I know in fact it is actually happening right now, actually today. So I just wanted to share that, and maybe if those of you who have colleagues in the health front who's working in Geneva, you can get some information from them on how that's been happening. Thank you. Over.
Thank you.
Thank you. Last but not least, Amer.
Thank you very much, Kat. Maybe we come back to the course once again, where we divided the multilateral diplomacy process into 3 phases: the phase of deliberations, the phase of negotiation, and the phase of decision making. And then we can start to segment our import of online platforms into one or the other of these 3 phases. And my earlier comment was more regarding protocols. So I'm not that conservative with them to the extent of importing online platforms and negotiations in general, but it's just that this protocol issue needs to be well taken into account. And to Ambassador Kishan Rana's question, very, very relevant one. But I can say that even before COVID-19, there were so many examples whereby a number of multilateral outcomes were negotiated wholly through online platforms. So the silence procedure itself, whereby a draft statement or a draft outcome is circulated among the participants and given a certain time lapse, and if none have objected, then it becomes an adopted one, is a very clear example of an online quote-unquote negotiation of a multilateral document. And there are other examples as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, Katerina, I have to close down now, no? It was very helpful. I think it was seen, and the discussion also, besides some of the participants mentioning it's not possible because you don't have the corridor discussions, or the coffee breaks, or the trying to, I think you mentioned horse trading. There's other that said it is possible because it's already happening. I think you mentioned the written exchange and put a paper or a document to silence procedure. Explains maybe also why we have this different opinion in the poll in the beginning. I think what we can say at the very end, I think both also from a personal experience, where we're also trying to see how we can start to also do the drafting exercise on a virtual basis. We did experience it's possible. I think both is true, because you have to know the people, so that maybe you cannot have a coffee together, but you could use like your phone beside and then exchange through WhatsApp or just a different media to do like this horse trading, as you mentioned it. So I think I find it interesting that at the end we would probably find together that both sides is needed to have. Virtually we can use also because we're forced to, but it's still important that you know each other so you can exchange, if not in the coffee corner, then at least through another instrument like as the phones, for instance. I think that I have to shut down, Katerina. If you correct me, maybe you want to have a closing remark.
Well, thank you for this discussion. As always, many comments that we can't quite do justice to. Obviously, in the follow-up to this meeting, we will provide a summary, but I think we touched on many important issues, such as how to recreate corridor discussions or how to do justice to the process, such as drafting, negotiating, etc. So thank you so much, Katerina, for leading us to this discussion. And then we have one last session before there's another coffee break and before this conference will close formally. So last but not least, in this final session, we will discuss translation and interpretation. So the title of our session is Bonjour, Buenos Dias, Guten Morgen, Translation and Interpretation for the New Online Diplomacy. Our moderator is Christopher McGuinness from the College of Europe. Over to you, Christopher.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, that's great. Sometimes my microphone doesn't work, so it can sometimes be a little bit of a challenge. Hi everyone, as Katerina has said, I am a student at the College of Europe studying diplomacy. I've always been passionate about languages, so I think today is quite a nice time to bring that passion back to the fore. I wanted to start a little bit, well, I guess first I would like to say that this follows on languages and the role of languages in diplomacy and in online meetings follows on quite nicely from previous session, because at the base of procedures and negotiation is language, and I think that kind of these two ideas couple well together. I first would like to also start with a small quote from or citation from Murakami, which is about language learning. So he says that learning another language is like becoming another person. And I think for diplomats, that's something we all probably have to know how to do sometimes. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about diplomacy and interpretation and translation for online meetings. I then would like to ask you some questions about your experience and discuss your thoughts on diplomacy, interpretation, and translation through a word cloud or through several word clouds. And then I would like to bring back my perspective and your perspectives together in some key takeaways very shortly at the end of this 15 minutes. So I guess, first of all, in this first part of the session, or the small session, do diplomacy and multilingualism, thus interpretation and translation, logically go together? I'd like to ask this question. Diplomacy is about communication. It's about being understood and controlling how you're understood. It's about how you understand. And thus, language is an essential part of communication for diplomacy. So some might think that diplomacy need not go beyond the realm of English. Perhaps some diplomats and professionals who are monolingual maybe are a bit blind to linguistic diversity, or at least choose to make a conscious choice to favor English as the lingua franca. I guess in a world dominated by Twitter diplomacy, mostly conducted in English, it would be easy to conclude that interpretation and translation are dead. I would like to argue that that's not the case. So first of all, I guess we should have probably started with this, but what is translation and interpretation in an offline context? Because I think that's where we have to first look before we take it onto an online context. Translation is the communication of meaning from one language, the source, to another language, the target. Translation refers to written information, whereas interpretation is for spoken communication and refers to oral information as far as to oral information being translated, thus interpreted. I guess for me as a former languages student, it's probably the hardest form of translation to master. So what is translation and interpretation in online meetings? In an online context, both forms can be used in today's world of online meetings. In Zoom and on WebEx, I guess Big Blue Button and Adobe Connect do not offer this service yet, but I imagine that the service will be provided at some point in other platforms as language interpretation and translation are normalized in the online world. So to go back to the how to do it in an online context, interpreters can be used during live events. Zoom and WebEx can allow for interpreters to be assigned in the room, in the actual room, during a live event, and Zoom allows you to assign the role of interpreter to a participant via email. Language channels are present in the meetings where those choosing interpretation can tune in to the translated audio. It is also possible to have the source language at a lower volume, so that you really have a whole spectrum of possibilities. So I think I will skip now quickly to
Christopher, because we just have it on the screen, so can I put everyone's attention on what we have on the screen?
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Which is a very short survey for you, just to get an impression. So this is on Mentimeter. In order to participate, you need to go to menti.com. That's MENTI.com. You will be asked to type in a code. In this case, it's 252196. And then you can answer this question for us, just to get a feeling of the different opinions in the room. The question is basically asks you to complete a sentence. And the sentence is, translation and interpretation in online meetings for diplomacy is. We already have a few answers. Is crucial, is inclusive, important, and at the essential. So I think in the room, we really have a sense that translation and interpretation are of utmost importance. Is there anyone who would like to reflect on what they put here or what they see other colleagues responding to this question? One comment in the chat that I would like to bring in is from Ambassador Kishan Rana, who makes a very important point, again, on the dominance of English and the challenges related to that dominance. He says, drafting groups at the UN cheerfully work in English. At the same time, he says, when you try to draft in several languages, that might complicate matters. So, Kishan, would you like to come in on this and explain a bit more?
A very short point. As far as I know, all drafting groups, I'm not talking of the European Union, mind you, I'm talking of international gatherings at the UN or agencies or global conferences, WTO, for example. As far as I know, all drafting is carried out in English. Yes, there are delegates who don't speak English well. They bring their own interpreter who whispers in their ear what's going on. Not a very efficient process. I suspect that this theme is needlessly complicating matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kishan. And that kind of reflects the kind of two perspectives we see in responses to mentees. So some say it's important for inclusiveness, absolutely crucial. But there are some people who say it actually complicates things. There's also an interesting point on sign language, which is something we haven't touched upon yet.
I think that's a really interesting word cloud, and I was very optimistic at the beginning of when the first few words were put on the screen, and I think a more balanced picture is now presented, and I think I really appreciate the ambassador's comments from a UN perspective. I just know personally a little bit more the EU perspective, and I think maybe in the UN forum, it makes more sense to have English as a lingua franca, in there I think it could be more complicated to push the linguistic questions in diplomacy. But I would be interested to hear anyone's thoughts on how their own working experience in diplomacy as a diplomat or in academia studying diplomacy, and what they think of the role of languages and how it can be translated into an online context. Would it just make things more complicated, or would it actually facilitate diplomacy?
I have my colleague Ginger Pak from Diplo, who, if you attended the main session, the introductory session, you already met her, and she's very passionate about translation interpretation, especially from this inclusiveness perspective. So Ginger, you already made a comment in the chat, which is very interesting. So would you like to elaborate a bit more or bring in any additional points?
Thanks, Kat. Thanks, everyone. This input is very important, and Christopher has made some excellent points. I personally agree with Christopher that translation and interpretation are key element for inclusion in deliberations. And as we have seen as the conference develops, and anyone who's attended and listened to the intangible discomfort of disconnection caused by a perceived cacophony of voices or images or text, giving a literal and virtual tower of babel and sensation. So for meetings to be linguistically, physically, and otherwise inclusive, because I don't know if Eric is here, but we've been hearing many facets of inclusion that we are not always aware of, and that may also be included in interpretation, because signing is interpretation, how we present the audio and visual. But we need to address these questions because it's not just translation, it's not just UN meetings, even though this is a diplomacy track, there is wider inclusion now in these discussions. And we do need to make sure that all of these possibilities are accessible to other kinds of people. They're not different kinds of people. I apologize for misspeaking. People with different kinds of abilities and above all, I see this as an inclusion. Even in UN processes, I think we need to be inclusive of, although the standard of entry for diplomats is much higher. They're highly trained, very capable. I think we need to keep inclusion and interpretation of all kinds on high. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ginger. And I think when we talk about translation and interpretation, we're just kind of scratching the surface. As you mentioned, people who are differently abled and kind of catering to these concerns as well. We are out of time, basically. We are moving into the next coffee break. But to wrap up, I would like to, Christopher, would you like to wrap up? Because
yeah, I think I'd be very happy to bring together some takeaways from this meeting. I really enjoyed presenting it, and it's a subject I would say probably quite close to my heart. That is of linguistic diversity, because ultimately I'm maybe exposed to that more in the EU context than in maybe the UN context. I'm studying diplomacy at the College of Europe, where linguistic diversity is very prevalent and cherished. So I think to bring away a few takeaways, linguistic diversity is important. I think there is a bigger question we have to look at, is how do we make it linguistic diversity possible at an online level without actually making it more complicated. But I think if there's a will, there's a way. And for e-translation and e-interpretation in online meetings, I think they are perfectly possible and doable. And I think there is a real reason behind them, and that is one of inclusion and the depth. Not only the equality of participation, but the depth of participation is something we ought to think about when considering e-translation and e-interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So this actually wraps up our diplomacy track. Thank you for being here, for joining us. Again, several options for you before our concluding session. So until the full hours, we will have, again, the opportunity for coffee break, for visiting the art exhibition, or for just staying in this room. To navigate and find the different links for these meetings, again, go to our main page, meetings.diplomacy.edu/live. You will have the opportunity to join the coffee lounge, visit the art exhibition. At the hour, we will all meet back again in the main hall, for wrapping up and for the main takeaways. So we have about 12 minutes to mingle until we go back to the main hall. Thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you for all the speakers in this track. It has been extremely enlightening. And I think we have a long list of issues that need to be addressed as we go forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katarina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. And thank you, everyone in the room, for your comments and discussion. It has been very important and very enlightening.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Christopher. Really appreciate your moderation. And I really learned a lot from the input. Thank you very much for the chat as well.
Thank you to you and all at Diplo for a great course.
Kat, maybe we could have people unmute without permission and just open the discussion. If there's anyone who wants to continue with their coffee break right here, we can just grab our coffee and hear some people who didn't perhaps get a chance to speak.
I think people can unmute themselves. If there's any issue with that, please let me know. One important thing, so as I said, in about 10 minutes, we all meet back in the main hall. Direct link for that is this. So you will then leave this meeting and rejoin everyone in the main hall. And I just put the link in the chat in case there's any issue with navigation.
I was curious if there are any other people or any people that could bring up disadvantages to including interpretation and captioning. Kishan made some really good points, and I have heard others talk about the funding problems, the complexity especially for small meetings, anyone have a point on that? Christopher, what's your experience?
My experience would be that it's becoming less of an issue because the next generation of diplomats are by default English speakers or very fluent, very fluent in English. Maybe not English speakers, but have received quite a lot of education in English already. But I would say that diplomats are, to some extent, an elite, and the people they represent don't tend to always be as how should we say fluent in English as maybe themselves. So I think we have to I think if diplomats are representing their country and their country's interest and also the global interest, I think we have to be connected to the home country or the world as a whole. And if we're connected to those as a whole, that means we must take into consideration linguistic diversity. That's my personal little axe to grind, but I think it's a really important one. But maybe I'm clouded by the European Union's judgment and the mottos of the one is which is united in diversity, etc., etc. I think we've all heard it before.
It's an interesting point, and also what I picked up in the discussion, this difference between different international organizations where by their very nature there might be a different approach to translation and languages. As we said in the discussion, EU is different from the UN and the approach here. An interesting point from kind of my personal perspective, and this goes back to my personal passion. I lived in Wales for about 9 years, and Wales has its own language, the Welsh language, which is a minority language which less than 1 million people speak worldwide. So when we discuss linguistic diversity, there's often a focus on the big languages. So in the UN context, it's 5 or 6. In the EU, it's the official EU languages, which are the member state languages. I'm not sure if the EU is considering minority languages, but that's another aspect we often forget. So away from the big languages, and how do we address these kind of issues? In my case, it's Welsh, but many countries have minority languages.
In my case, it will be no surprise from my accent that it's Scots and Gaelic, which are two different languages. One is slightly more controversial than the other, unfortunately. But yeah, I think minority languages are everywhere. And I think if we are talking about, we're talking about the UN and UNESCO quite a lot, or we're talking a lot about the UN, and UNESCO is something that is part of the UN structure. And I think immaterial cultural value is probably most prevalent with languages. These are something that have been with us for thousands of years and hundreds of years, and we should. I think this is maybe not the role of a diplomat to say what we should do with that immaterial cultural wealth, but I think it's really important that we try to cultivate that rather than homogenize. That's maybe going off the diplomatic tools piece, so to speak. But yeah.
But it's an interesting point, and obviously, yeah, it seems to be not a concern for international relations, but perhaps it should be. And yeah, I mentioned Wales because I was kind of playing off your accent. To be honest, I was waiting for the comment about the Irish or Scottish languages.
Yeah, the Welsh is a very well protected language in Wales. It's very well regarded and very as a minority language. It gets quite a lot of good support, I think. But I don't know many Welsh people, which is quite shocking. But that's a story for another time.
Good.
Lo consigo un poquito irónico que estamos hablando de la dificultad de los angloparlantes. So now I'll go back to English.
Yes.
I find it a bit ironic that we are discussing the difficulties of English speakers.
Estoy de acuerdo.
Cónchale. Yeah. Quizás debemos cambiar la discusión a otro idioma.
Vincutino,
I'm sorry.
No es tan muy buena.
I don't want to be rude, but it's a point I wanted to make in every session. There is a reason, you know, and when we're talking about English to English, rather than Spanish, German, you know, how many languages do we have represented here? And then considering sign language and other options. I understand it. I think it's an excellent topic. I really appreciate your bringing it up, but yeah, I guess I made my point.
Thanks, Ginger. On my part, I will be moving to the main session now. I think we have to slowly close. Thanks everyone who's still with us. Thanks again, Christopher.
Thank you.
And I will see you shortly in the main room. Let's all walk over there together. Thank you.
Yeah.